So I'm Chris Wohlforth. I'm the acting director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Chase Peace Prize event. The Chase Peace Prize was created through a bequest in 1939 from Edward M. Chase, who was a Lithuanian native who moved to New Hampshire, developed a furniture enterprise here, became very successful, and spent the latter part of his life engaged in philanthropy. He had a number of different philanthropic causes, but one of his great concerns was the prevalence of war in his era and the challenges of creating a lasting peace. His bequest of $10,000 to Dartmouth was matched by similar bequests to Harvard and to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Ours is the only one that continues to actively do a prize and an event associated with it. I checked up on the other institutions, and they're using the funds in other ways, but we're really pleased to continue to use this prize to highlight the very excellent work of Dartmouth students. Each year we offer two Chase Peace Prizes. One is given for an undergraduate essay. The deadline for the essay contest is in April every year, and it carries a prize of $500. It's awarded either to original essays or papers that students have written for Dartmouth courses. And the topics can be on any subject in the college related to war and peace. Equally, we have a very open policy for the Chase Peace Prize Senior Thesis Contest. It's open to all undergraduates writing honors theses in any discipline that address the topic of war and peace, again, very broadly defined. And that carries not only a monetary prize, but also the opportunity for the recent graduate to come back to Dartmouth to appear on a panel peopled with experts in the student's thesis topic subject to treat the thesis very seriously. So it's a program that we're very proud of, and I'm delighted that you're all here today to witness the great work of Charles Dameron and to listen to experts in his field address it very seriously. As is our tradition, we ask the recipient's thesis advisor to moderate today's event. And so I'm going to ask the Daniel Webster Professor of Government, William Wohlforth, to come up and do the introductions and to take the question and answer period at the end. Thanks very much.
Well, I know those applause are for you, Chris, not for me walking up on the stage. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to be at this event. And my humble role here is to simply introduce our panelists, but I can't resist saying how proud I am, perhaps slightly less proud than Charlie himself about his work, and perhaps slightly less proud than his parents at what their son has wrought. But after those three individuals, I may well be the proudest person standing here as his senior thesis advisor. What I'd like to do is just introduce our three speakers in the order at which you see them. To my left, starting with Dartmouth alumnus of the class of 2011, Charlie Dameron. Charlie early showed immense wisdom and judgment in deciding to transfer from another institution, Duke, to Dartmouth in his freshman year, and furthermore to major in the subject of government. And going from those exercises in wisdom, he moved on to many other heights, majoring and doing splendidly in our department, and ultimately perhaps the one point where he slipped up slightly was choosing me as an advisor, but at the end of the day he ended up writing a fabulous thesis that basically is asking the question of how and under what circumstances can a government best influence the attitudes of people in foreign countries towards that government? Are you better off being objective or better off actually sort of spinning things to be the most favorable for your country, for your country's image? And he's about to tell you the results that he got from that thesis. So I look very much forward to hearing from him. The only other thing to say is, amazingly, many of you students are interested in getting internships. Now, Charlie managed to wangle an internship where? At Radio Free Europe in Prague, working for the very institution that plays a big role in his thesis. And I won't go on to suggest some of the other highlights and attractions that internship might have. But he right now is doing research and presenting actual reporting that's being broadcast on Radio Free Europe. When he's done with that internship, he'll be dragged back to the United States to join the incoming class at Yale Law School, surely a somewhat less exciting post than what you're doing right now. We are extremely fortunate to have commenting and responding to Charlie's work, two distinguished guests whose work directly fits in the area of Charlie's research. Sitting to the left of Charlie is Ross Johnson, who is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, an advisor to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and has held a long list of very senior positions at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in the crucial years of 1988 to 2002. You'll note that some events rather important to Radio Free Europe occurred during those years. He has published works, again, very closely related to the subject matter that we're discussing today, including Cold War Broadcasting, Impact on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, a collection of studies and documents, which is a fascinating collection that Charlie made a lot of use of in his work, and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, the CIA Years and Beyond. And finally, in 2008, he published Communicating with the World of Islam. So hard to imagine a more appropriate and knowledgeable a guest, except perhaps, who knows, we can argue about it later, the person sitting to his left, who is Ken Osgood, who's the director of the McBride Honors Program in Public Affairs and associate professor in the Division of Liberal Arts and International Studies at the Colorado School of Mines. He's a prolific historian and author on U.S. Cold War history, whose work, it's a varied portfolio of work, but explores the relationship between foreign relations, domestic politics, propaganda, and culture. To highlight a couple of his works that are particularly relevant to today's subject matter, he's worked on, he published in 2006 the volume Total Cold War, Eisenhower's Secret Propaganda Battle at Home and Abroad. He's also edited an important collection on the United States and public diplomacy. So we're very fortunate to have these guests. Charlie will speak for about 10 minutes or so, followed by 15 minutes approximately from each of our guests, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. So without further ado, Charlie, welcome to the podium. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Professor Wohlforth. And when I transferred from Duke, I was both a history and a government major, and my history professors always said that majoring in government was my biggest mistake, but hopefully we'll prove them wrong today. I want to, before I launch into the talk, I want to thank a few people. First, thank you to Dr. Chris Wohlforth and the Dickey Center for this prize, which I definitely didn't deserve, but I'll take it anyway. It's a privilege to be here. It's great to be back at Dartmouth. Thanks to my fellow panelists, Kenneth Osgood and Ross Johnson, for coming up to Hanover to comment on the thesis. I'm really humbled to be on a panel with both of you, and I look forward to learning from what you have to say today. And finally, I want to thank the two people who are central in guiding me through this thesis, Professor Ben Valentino in the audience and Professor Wohlforth. This thing wouldn't have gotten off the ground without either of them, and they pushed me and prodded me into putting together a final version capable of winning the Chase Peace Prize. And it's due to their patient mentorship that I have the chance to come back, so I'm deeply grateful to them for that. It's fitting that Ross Johnson is here because this thesis was mostly inspired by something he said at an event I attended in Washington in the summer of 2010. I'd just begun a summer internship at Radio Free Europe in Washington and had been assigned to go and write about a film screening in town, To Russia with Love, a documentary that highlighted the role Radio Free Europe played in the Soviet sphere during the Cold War. Ross was at this screening to provide his perspective as a former director of Radio Free Europe and also to take questions from the audience. In the audience was a fascinating historical character named Oleg Kalugin. Mr. Kalugin is a former KGB general who for years was in charge of the counterintelligence division of the KGB. And in the 1990s, he moved to Washington, and he's been in the U.S. ever since. After the documentary ended, Kalugin raised his hand and began unleashing a barrage of criticism of U.S. international broadcasting. The gist of his point, in true Soviet style, was that U.S. propaganda is ineffective because it doesn't do enough to spread disinformation about America's enemies. He argued that American propaganda, such as it is limp and ineffective. And Ross hit back at Kalugin with a few words that stuck with me then and pushed me into adopting this thesis topic. He said, "Oleg, you're wrong. The best propaganda is the truth." In a sentence, that's what this thesis is about. It's about why it's in the United States' national interest to broadcast accurate and objective news about the world to the rest of the world, to make honest news out of government propaganda. Of course, truth and objectivity are slippery concepts, so my thesis focused on a certain standard of objectivity that I called empathetic objectivity. And that idea is relatively simple. It's that when you're covering the news, you should cover it with the assumptions and the worldview of your target audience foremost in mind. Now, to all of us, that just sounds like ordinary responsible journalism. But it's a tough thing to achieve for international broadcasters that are being funded by a particular host government. It's one thing for CNN to report on the war in Afghanistan to its American viewers back home. That's pretty straightforward. It's a whole other problem for an American-funded media outlet like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, which broadcasts to Afghanistan in Dari and Pashto, to cover the war in a way that meets the expectations of local Afghans, no matter what the US government may say. My thesis looked at historical examples and used an experimental survey to test different approaches to international broadcasting. It included examples from the BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Al Jazeera, and Al Hurra, which is the United States' 24-hour satellite TV news channel to the Arab world. Basically, I found that Ross was right. The more objective and the more truthful the broadcast, the more people want to listen to it. And listenership translates to impact. My thesis showed that at crucial moments, in Europe at the end of the Cold War, or today in the Middle East, international broadcasters can have a major historical role in empowering ordinary people. In the Cold War, the United States and its allies pursued a very effective propaganda war against the United States and against the Soviet Union and its allies. The propaganda that it started with in the 1940s and 1950s was very primitive, the mirror image of Soviet propaganda, shrill and strident. But over time, it developed into a more sophisticated network of broadcasters capable of providing accurate news and pluralistic news analysis to people who otherwise had access to neither. My thesis argued that the key to this evolution and sophistication was good audience research, that is, good listening. Over time, Radio Free Europe, the BBC, and the Voice of America were better able to meet the expectations of their audiences because they spent a great deal of time examining the political biases and worldview of their audiences, asking listeners behind the Iron Curtain what they wanted to listen to, and adjusting their broadcasting programming accordingly. People who would be well placed to know have often testified to the profound effect of Western propaganda during the Cold War. Emil Constantinescu, who grew up in communist Romania and later became one of Romania's first post-communist presidents, summed up the effect of one of the Western broadcasters thus: "Radio Free Europe," he said, "has been a lot more important than the armies and the most sophisticated missiles. The missiles that destroyed communism were launched from Radio Free Europe, and this was Washington's most important investment during the Cold War." I don't know whether the Americans realize this now, 7 years after the fall of communism, but we, Romanians, understand it perfectly well. My thesis also looked to the contemporary Middle East, where the public sphere has been dominated for the past decade by Al Jazeera. Last year, during the Arab Spring, Al Jazeera emerged as one of the most potent political forces in the region. Middle East media expert Mark Lynch said in the New York Times then that although Al Jazeera did not cause the events of the Arab Spring, quote, "It's almost impossible to imagine all this happening without Al Jazeera." Al Jazeera is funded directly by the government of Qatar, and the network's wide popularity across the region has given the Qatari government power and influence that tiny Qatar would not and would never be able to achieve through military prowess. But what's remarkable about Al Jazeera is the novelty of its approach to the news. It wasn't set up to be the government's mouthpiece. Rather, it was established to become the Middle East's liberal, in-house critic, raising questions about the legitimacy of regimes that torture and maim their own people, introducing key human rights concepts, and, most importantly, standing through its own example for free speech and a diversity of opinion. Al Jazeera has stuck to much the same formula established by the BBC and Radio Free Europe during the Cold War, mixing excellent news bulletin broadcasts with forum shows and debates that open up a variety of perspectives to Arab audiences who, until recently, had to make do with terribly drab state-run news networks. Moreover, Al Jazeera sees itself as a guardian of its audience's interests and an advocate on their behalf. It aims to be objective in its presentation of the news, but more than that, it wants its audiences to know that Al Jazeera belongs to them. That's the key to its success, as it was the key to success for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty during the Cold War. The dazzling achievement of Al Jazeera sharply contrasts with the failure of the U.S. effort at satellite TV in the Arab world, Al Hurra Television. Al Hurra has not matched up to America's storied broadcasters, Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, and its journalistic standards have been generally weak. The network is held in wide disrepute in the region, not, I believe, because it is simply an American network, but because it's widely understood that Al Hurra generally parrots the U.S. government line on issues of import to Arab audiences. Independent focus groups in the Middle East have asserted that Al Hurra alienates Arab audiences by treating them as objects of American foreign policy rather than as media consumers and political actors in their own right. Why does all of this matter? I think you could argue that one of America's most powerful political assets is the power of its reputation. We're entering an era when America's leadership in the world is being questioned more sharply than ever, and an era in which the United States' fiscal situation means that we're less able to flex our military advantage than we were in the past. Broadcasting, which is a cheap way of gaining influence, offers up a valuable and powerful tool for locking in America's global leadership and promoting the democratic values that help to make our world a safer place. It's a diplomatic tool we have used brilliantly before and that we ought to be putting to better use today. Thanks.
Next, we'll hear from Ross Johnson. Do you prefer to stand or?
I'll try it over there.
Okay,
I'll try it. Bear with me here. I'm adjusting to some new visual challenges. We'll see how this works the best. I want to congratulate Charlie for an outstanding thesis. I think it's a very useful and a very sensitive discussion of essential ingredients of effective mass international communication. I find myself in agreement with almost everything I think in the thesis. My perspective and what I want to talk about here is some of the lessons of Cold War broadcasting, especially Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, for today and tomorrow. And you'll understand my perspective is in part based on my own background. Half my professional career was at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in the late 60s and after 1988. The core concept of Charles' thesis, empathetic objectivity, I think that's an excellent way of describing what is a key to effective international communication to foreign audiences who lack free media of their own. We could also call this audience-centric broadcasting. Objectivity, that signifies comprehensive, balanced, non-prejudiced, non-spun, non-slanted coverage of an issue. And RFE and RL came to understand the importance of that objectivity very early on. Let me cite one illustration from 1957, when not the U.S. government, but RFE directors in New York tried to impose slanted U.S. press reviews on their subordinates in Munich, which is where the RFE headquarters were until 1995. And the context here was the Sputnik, the first Earth satellite launched by the Russians that caused Great Depression among some American circles. We're losing, they're winning. And the caution from New York was against broadcasting Western press reviews reflecting, quote, temporarily depressed and basically unsound press opinions about facts that allow far more than one interpretation. Well, the managers, the Americans and the exiles alike in Munich, would have none of that. And their answer was, it's naive for us to assume that we can spoon feed our listeners our own special rose-colored view of world affairs, or to assume that they will accept this view. Number of good quotes there. The Polish service director Jan Nowak said, "It's the communists who believe in selectivity in press reviews. People consequently do not believe them, nor will they believe us if they find us doing the same thing." Romanian service director Noel Bernard said, "We are broadcasting to convince our audience. We must approach them in such a way as to seem credible and convincing to them." And it's to them, it's that part that's important, not to us, to them. So objectivity, it was important in 1957, it's crucial today. The same goes for empathy, or in Charlie's words, being a domestic guardian of the audiences. Another way of describing this is relevance to the audience. There were a number of things that made Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty relevant, their broadcasts relevant to the audiences during the Cold War. I won't go through the whole list now. We could come back to that. These country radio stations were all purpose, full service, substitute radio stations for the domestic free radios that did not exist, could not exist under those circumstances. So they became known as surrogate radios. And Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were networks of these country-focused surrogate radios, enjoying in turn great autonomy, great distance from the US government that funded them. There was a government-endorsed framework, to be sure, but there was almost never any government involvement in the editorial process. In the 3 years when I was director of Radio Free Europe, meaning directly responsible for East European broadcasting and research, no US government official ever tried to tell me what should be on the air during that period. Audience feedback was crucial, and again, that's an important part of the thesis. And it increased. It was able to be magnified over the years as as more travelers could come out of the Soviet sphere, as censorship loosened in some respects. And Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty organized a massive kind of second best audience research effort, well covered in the thesis. I would note that effort between 1960 and 1990 interviewed 10,000 East European visitors. These weren't refugees, these were visitors who were going back and therefore thought to be more representative of their compatriots at home. And 3,000 Soviet visitors. And this was done using a network of survey research firms in Europe, in Western Europe and elsewhere. These measures, all this helped broadcasters keep in touch with their audiences, allowed these audiences to consider these radio stations their own. And another example or anecdote, I was in Poland, in Wrocław in December, visiting the Ossolineum Institute and Library, talking to the director about Radio Free Europe. He wasn't very interested in the American side of Radio Free Europe. He was insistent that the RFE Polish radio, that the RFE Polish service was our radio, his radio. So not surrogate radio, that's Washington jargon. Our radio, that's the way a Pole thought about it. And that, I think, is a measure of effectiveness. Now, the thesis, and Charles in the thesis suggests that Al Jazeera Arabic satellite television has successfully applied this model, if you will, to part of to the Arab-speaking world, much of the Arab-speaking world. Clearly, and I think that's the case, Arab language satellite television was the main information source, much more than social media, actually, during the Arab revolts. I haven't looked at Al Jazeera's record in detail. I think the story is well told in the thesis. My only caveat is its relative importance may be overstated a bit because there are several hundred Arab language satellite TV stations, and there's some others that stand out, not just Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and perhaps a few others. What I've said so far, and what is dealt with so successfully, I think, in the thesis, is these are questions of how. If you want to communicate effectively to foreign audiences, there's some things that you want to do, and there's some things you don't want to do. But there's another question here, which is why? Why should we do this? What's the end? What's the purpose? What's the objective? What's the justification to spend public funds, taxpayer money? There's some, to my mind, specious objectives. One is regime change, whatever that is. That's not what broadcasts can do. Another specious objective is public diplomacy. If that's meant to mean promoting America abroad, selling America, improving how foreigners feel about the United States, making them hate us less in the much used words. Visitor programs may be able to do that. American libraries, American corners may be able to do that. Cultural outreach, perhaps. It was once a function of the Voice of America, an important one. I don't think it is today any longer. Nor do I think you can justify spending public funds just for the purpose of disseminating information for its own sake. Throw it out there. That's a necessary step, but it's not sufficient. So why should this be done? During the Cold War, RFE and RL were instruments of containment in the sense that George Kennan formulated that concept. Intended to put the adversary, the Soviet regime and its satellites in those days, under strain, to exploit without violence internal contradictions in the Soviet sphere. In the words of a Swiss editor commenting favorably on the startup of RFE broadcasts in 1951, this was letting Czechs and Slovaks know that the West does not forget them, that it is determined to start a friendly conversation with them over the heads of their leaders on questions of freedom and social progress. Or in the words of the first RFE Polish broadcast from Munich in 1952, this was taking up a struggle not in the forest, not in the streets, not in the underground, but in the Polish soul, within the four walls of a Polish house. So that Cold War, if you will, rationale, weakening an adversary, that by engaging nonviolently the society it suppresses, I think that applies today for repressive regimes hostile to the United States, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Cuba, we can think of others. It's important, let's be modest in our expectations. Free information from outside can never be a primary agent of change in such countries. It can reinforce indigenous forces of change when and as they develop, but that requires investment. That requires patience. I think that's a proper mission for countries like this. What is totally unrealistic, to my mind, is the notion that some put forth that somehow if these broadcasts, get tougher, if people yell louder, that they can bring down the temple of repressive governments. That's an illusion. But there's, of course, another whole set of audiences in the larger Middle East, involving people in unfree or semi-free or transitional societies ruled by governments friendly in various degrees to the United States and important to U.S. security and economic interests. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, others. U.S. broadcasts and broadcasts by now, of course, means web, it means social media, it means everything. U.S.-funded broadcasts to this part of the world after 9/11, in my view, expanded too quickly and with far too little thought as to their purpose. And I think that's also dealt with very well in the thesis. That applies to Al-Hura. Well, I think, Charles, I think your analysis of Alhura's early failings are persuasive. Maybe the story is not quite that black because maybe there's been a learning experience, and I have the impression that Alhura is a bit better today than it was at the startup. And in any case, unlike the Cold War, this is the age of audience demand for multiple information sources on multiple platforms. And there's always going to be an audience for relevant information and a hunger for multiple sources. Look at Egypt today. So I think maybe Alhura still can play a role. A BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, commissioned a spot telephone poll of Cairo and Alexandria residents early in 2011. That indicated actually that Al Arabiya was the most watched TV station. Alhura was used by a quarter of the sample. Actually, at that point, I mean, with this very limited sample, I think 500 telephone polled people, Alhura slightly more than Al Jazeera in that poll. But again, to what end? Alhura and U.S.-funded Arab language radio broadcasts, they cannot, in my view, usefully aim to improve Arab public opinion about the United States. They cannot usefully aim to increase support for day-to-day American foreign policies, Israel, Iran, you name it. If that's your purpose, save your money. What I think these kind of broadcasts can usefully do is, in these countries and for these audiences, help broaden the sphere of public discourse, encourage development of civil society, indirectly support moderate Muslims in their terms, not in our terms, in their terms, discredit terrorism, encourage peaceful transition from rigid authoritarianism. The aim should be endorsements like the Radio Free, Europe Radio Liberty, organized Radio Free Iraq one from one listener. You don't sound like an American radio at all. You sound like an Iraqi radio. These are objectives, to my mind, very much in the U.S. national interest. The challenges are much tougher than Western broadcasts faced during the Cold War. But again, I think they're very, these are objectives well worth doing and well worth costing what at most is going to be a very tiny fraction of what the U.S. spends on national security. But if this is to be done, if these funds are to be usefully spent, this requires the kind of empathetic objectivity that's the subject of this thesis. And it requires especially distance from the government, from this government here in this country that is funding these operations.
Thanks very much. And next is Professor Osgood. Are you also going?
Sure.
Great.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back in Hanover. It's great to be on a panel with Bill and Ross, whose work has been so influential to me. I'd like to thank Chris for the invitation, Sharon for making the arrangements, and I'd like to thank Charles for writing such a provocative and thought-provoking thesis. And I have to say that by the time I read to page 4, I already knew what I was going to say today. By page 4, I had 3 impressions of this thesis, all of which grew stronger as I read on. First, without question, this thesis deserves this award. And I said that to myself when I got to page 4, and I still believed it when I got to page 154. It is an interesting, important, and impressive piece of work. The second thing that struck me, as I think will strike anyone who takes a look at it, is the superior quality of the writing and the elegance of the argumentation. I made a comment to Bill earlier that our distinguished recipient today is woefully unsuited for both academia and law school by virtue of the extreme elegance that I enjoyed. Not only does his phrasing flow elegantly and effortlessly, but it does so in the context of an absolutely rigorous argument. And I have to confess, I read the thesis with the understanding that I would have to make critical comments. And that understanding is reinforced by, I see some of your friends in the room, and I thought to myself, you know, while he's out there living it up in Prague, the least I could do is do something for those of you who are slaving away here in Hanover. And so I read with a pen in my hand, as I always do, and every now and then I would say to myself, aha! And what about this? And I'd scribble it, you know, with great force in the margins. And then I would flip the page. And there Charles would acknowledge and then demolish my objections at every turn. And I said to myself, what on earth am I going to say when I get to Hanover other than thank you for inviting me to enjoy your wonderful New England weather? In all seriousness, though, this thesis is not just a fine example of undergraduate scholarship. It is a marvelous example of scholarship, period. It deserves to be taken seriously beyond the narrow confines of this campus in the larger academic and policymaking communities. So on to my third observation that I had by page 4. Charlie asks a profoundly important question. And as I read, I was reminded of a similar question that was asked by a senior U.S. diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. He wrote an op-ed in which he complained about how the United States was losing the sort of ideological war against Osama bin Laden, and he asked, quote, how can a man in a cave outcommunicate the world's leading communications society? And permutations of this question have in fact appeared over and over again since the early 20th century. Americans have had this sort of recurring nightmare asked and expressed in questions and thoughts like, we are brilliant advertisers. We invented public relations. We can sell soap like no one else, and yet our adversaries continually beat us in the war of ideas. In fact, the Los Angeles Times in 1950 had a long editorial complaining about we are not very good at propaganda. And so Charlie's thesis in part speaks to overarching questions that have vexed policymakers and pundits for decades. If our American way of life is so self-evidently superior, why do we have such difficulty getting others to see this? How can ideological dictatorships, or even worse, violent extremists living in caves, be more persuasive and appealing than us? What do we need to do to out-communicate our adversaries? Now, if you look at the broad trajectory of the history of U.S. public diplomacy, you'll see that Americans have tended to fall into 4 camps on these questions. And there's basically been 4 paradigms for public diplomacy. And they've all conflicted and competed and generally kind of operated simultaneously and in tension. First, there's an advertising model. We need to do a hard sell. We need to sell the American way of life like we sell a product. The second is a public relations model, which suggests a softer and more sort of secretive and subtle sell. We can best persuade by sort of operating behind the scenes, by influencing the news that others report, and thereby sort of advancing our agenda. The third model would be a psychological warfare model. We need to operate like we're at war, but we need to use black techniques, subversion, bribery, whatever it takes, no holds barred type attitude. And fourth would be a journalistic model. We should aspire to do what we perceive the BBC aspires to do. Disseminate the news, establish credibility. And in many ways, Charles makes a very persuasive case for that third approach. He advocates a useful concept, actually a very useful concept, empathetic objectivity. We should tell the truth, and we should put a premium on our credibility, and we should do so in a way that reflects, and this is the important caveat that I didn't think quite emerged as strongly in your short summary, but in telling that truth, we should do so in a way that reflects the values, perceptions, and expectations of our audience. So it's not so much presenting the facts as you want to see them, as you want others to see them, but as they expect to see them. So in effect, Charles is reversing the question posed by Holbrooke. We shouldn't think of our goal as simply out-communicating our adversaries. We need to focus less on our enemies and less on the spin we want to take, and instead we should focus more on our audience. If we want to have any hope of winning over foreign public opinion, we first have to listen to it and understand it. So how do you do that? To many of us, this would seem an obvious question to ask, and it is one that U.S. public diplomats, as I'm sure Ross would attest, have asked. But usually in trying to answer that question, Americans have tended to focus on themselves for the answers. There's an element of mirror imaging that has been at work. This is what I would want, so this must be what they would want. And American public diplomats have rarely asked, what do they want to hear? What do they expect to hear? Instead, Americans have asked, what do we want them to hear? And Charlie's thesis really drives home, I think, that those are very different propositions. And he shows convincingly that the key to getting an audience is credibility. To be credible, we should pursue empathetic objectivity. But here, I read the thesis to mean something slightly different than Charlie suggested in his short summary to all of us today. He said, and I'm more or less somewhat quoting, the more objective it is, the more effective it is. Right? But that seems to me that's not exactly what his thesis suggested. He highlighted a sort of relative nature of objectivity. The more objective it appears to be to that audience, the more effective it will be. And so as Ross pointed out, it is an audience-focused model, both for public diplomacy and for assessing credibility. Now, herein lies the big challenge that emerges from Charlie's argument. What if this? What if what our audience wants to hear, we don't want to tell them, right? What if the audience is drawn to a message or a worldview that is directly at odds with U.S. government policy? And we see this difficult paradox emerge in a very interesting case study that Charles does in his last chapter. And he basically analyzes a test audience in the Middle East and explores how they would respond to two different versions of the same news story about a Predator drone strike. One version is very clinical and technical. It stresses the reasons for the strike and why it was necessary. It effectively sanitizes the killing. The other story does quite the opposite. It focuses on the human impact of the strike. It draws attention to the lives that were lost. And it causes you to think for a moment, at least, that these strikes have real costs. And in some ways, it causes you to question whether the ends justify the means. And Charles reveals that the sensational story was more likely to resonate with audiences in the Middle East. And it raises the question, if U.S. broadcasters disseminated this kind of story with this kind of empathetic slant that would be receptive, they would likely view it as more credible, but this kind of reporting would likely build an audience. But I wonder, could the U.S. government sponsor a broadcasting outlet that actually undermined a stated policy of the U.S. government in such a fashion? It is, after all, U.S. policy to rely heavily on drone attacks. Could it sponsor, not just sanction, but sponsor a media message that fundamentally called that policy into question? And so in the end, I think Charles' work should compel our policymakers to do some difficult soul-searching. Are we better off disseminating a message that resonates with our audience, but which at least gets them listening to us, even if that message may undermine our broader foreign policy goals? Or are we better off disseminating the message that sells our policies or puts them in a favorable light, even if we only get a tiny, insignificant audience to listen to that message? In the case of the Middle East, to read and reflect upon Charlie's conclusions is to perhaps throw up your arms and say it's all hopeless. To get a sizable audience, the United States might have to talk candidly and perhaps unflatteringly about Israel, a message that would invite the wrath of only 435 members of Congress. To get a sizable audience, we might have to speak unflatteringly about the Saudi monarchy or the Jordanian regime, or before the most recent revolutions, the regime of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. And so from this emerged some big important questions, and I'd like to highlight three just for us to ponder. One, how should U.S. broadcasting deal with situations when the goal of empathetic objectivity conflicts with the broader goals of U.S. policy? Or, for that matter, U.S. domestic politics, which he repeatedly reminds us is as much of an obstacle, if not more of one, than national security. Second, does this model work better in cases where U.S. broadcasting is fundamentally subversive? Is it easier to sort of have empathetic objectivity in cases when you're speaking to a regime that is, a populace that is receptive to such a message? For example, his two favorable case studies, Al Jazeera and Radio Free Europe, spoke to the people and against their regimes, or generally have that as sort of a subtext. Is it easier to win over this kind of audience? It's pretty easy to talk critically about rulers in the Middle East when they're in Syria or Iran, since doing so accords with our official attitudes and policies. But the better part of our foreign policy in the Middle East for many decades was revolved around supporting the governments in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel that were unpopular in various segments of that audience that we want to reach. So on these issues, the critical messages that might reflect an empathetic relationship with their audience might not serve U.S. interests all that well, or at least would not be perceived as such. And the third question is, are there cases where the climate of opinion is such that it would just be better for the U.S. to close shop altogether, to not broadcast directly to foreign publics? And reading Charlie's thesis, I couldn't help but think that Al-Hurra has done more harm than good in this respect, and that the only hope for Al-Hurra would be to become Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera is precisely what Al-Hurra is trying to outcommunicate. So we're stuck in a conundrum there. And so in such a situation, the U.S. is just blowing against the wind. And maybe the U.S. government should look for other ways to try to influence or win over the public. A U.S. government television station just isn't going to do it. So it's clear to me that Charles has thought very deeply about all of this, and I like to conclude by saying that I hope he doesn't become so enamored with Yale Law School that he continues this work, because I think he's really onto something, and I hope this is the beginning and not the end of his research on these questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have it open for questions, and in the course of answering those questions, panelists may well feel like they'd like to respond to others. But first, I'd love to, I say to panelists may in the Q&A have an opportunity to respond to each other, but first I'd really love to reach out to the audience for questions which may be directed to any individual or to the panel as a whole.
Charlie, I'm just interested to see your response to the whole idea put forth by Professor Osgood about how do you deal with this whole, maybe this empathetic objectivity is going to clash with the foreign policy, or maybe what they're trying to achieve with broadcaster news.
Well, I mean, I think that I guess basically I come down pretty simply on the side of I think it serves U.S. interests in the long run to be seen as an honest broker of information, and to be seen as the type of society that's willing to that is actually willing to fund opinions and reporting that conflicts with official government policy, because it stands as an example of I think important values and social behaviors that have helped to make the United States the global leader that it is, and because I think it's a sign of social strength. I think we have an incredible. Anyone who comes to this country understands the media environment that exists here, the wonderful pluralism that exists in our media environment. Most countries don't have that kind of rich media environment, and I think it's important for foreign publics to get a taste of it in U.S. international broadcasting, and I think so. I guess my feeling is, it's sort of a pat answer, but I think in the long run, even if it's uncomfortable for the State Department or the Defense Department, the United States government has got something special with its credibility, and that's something worth protecting. And I think it's well worth addressing those kind of issues head on, rather than shying away from them or toning them down in the interest of short-term U.S. policy. I think Ross got at that a little bit ago, and he said, we shouldn't use broadcast to justify short-term American interests. And so I think, I don't know. I think we should clearly always side on err on the side of just honest journalism, wherever that leads. So I mean, it's a tough issue, though. Obviously, that's a tough standard to adhere to.
I couldn't. Let me add a couple words to that. This tension, the potential conflict with the American policy of the day and the context of the audience is perhaps more sharply posed today in some of these cases than in the past, but the issues are not new. It was one of the, again, one of the strengths, I think, of the Radio Free Europe model that explicitly, and even in words in a number of the charters over the years, it was said that the broadcast need not, it was couched in different ways, need not support American foreign policy of the day. It was broadcasts covering the full range of dissent in the United States to the war in Vietnam that won Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty so much credibility in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union in those days. Now, yes, sure, there are constraints. There are constraints in any business, any practice of journalism. And there are going to be some constraints in a government-funded journalist operation as well. As one example, one of the things that the Radio Free Europe Czechoslovak service in the early days in Germany had to be silent about was the mass expulsion of Germans from Czechoslovakia right after World War II. That was a liability in terms of reaching the Czechoslovak audience. I mean, no matter how harshly one judges today that expulsion for Treibung, it was an article of faith for every Czech and Slovak in those early years that was proper, historically justified, and so on. And if you weren't talking about it, you weren't being properly patriotically Czech or Slovak. And yet that was taboo in Germany, and in the interests of American interests in Germany, a Radio Free Europe in Germany could not broadcast on that issue. So the solution was silence. Now that's pulling the punches, but the argument would be, but there were so many greater gains on the other side in terms of being able to broaden the sphere of discussion in Czechoslovakia on a whole range of issues, that it was justified to be silent on this one issue. Now, admittedly, that's a little harder to do today with the example of the drone strikes is a good one. You can't not report that. You can't keep it out of newscasts, so you can't be silent about it. You're going to have to cover it. You're going to have to be able to cover it in a way. I mean, this is the challenge, right? You're going to have to be covered. You're going to have to be able to cover it in a way that finds some resonance in the audience, and does not turn 435 members of Congress against you. Not easy, but maybe not impossible.
Yes, in the back.
I'm curious, in a world in which we manage to transmit empathetically objective messages to lots of different target audiences, is there the possibility that those messages in fact conflict? And in that scenario, if we're telling them, an honest, empathetic, objective message to a lot of different audiences, what are those audiences going to think when they look and see that we're, what's Israel going to think of our reporting on the drone strikes? How are the different audiences going to react when they realize we're doing the same thing for everyone else?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how many people kind of pay attention to those things, on a real grassroots level. But I do think that I don't think there's any. I don't see too much of a conflict. Dr. Osgood was right when he said that I didn't stress enough the sort of empathetic nature of objectivity and the relative nature of objectivity in my remarks. And really, I think the thing that sort of the philosophical thing that overcame me in the course of this thesis is that objectivity is in the eye of the beholder, and that it's only as objective as the listener thinks it is, and so we don't really. If you want to be credible to an audience, you have no choice but to play to different audiences in different ways. I don't think that's hypocritical. I don't think there's a hypocrisy or an inconsistency there, because it's an honest. I think it's part of an honest attempt at international dialogue and civil society development abroad, and so ideally. Radio Free Europe, or Radio Free Europe's broadcasts in Eastern Europe, or Al Hurra's broadcasts in the Middle East today, or Radio Free Asia, or Voice of America in Africa. Ideally, all those broadcasts are contributing to the development of even more voices that can open up different points of view. And I think ideally, with the example of we don't have Broadcast Israel, but say we had Broadcast Israel and to the Arab world. I mean, ideally, the development of different voices leads to a better synthesis between places and between audiences. But I don't think there's an inconsistency. I think it's what you have to do. It's part of capturing or getting the attention of different markets, and so I don't know. I'd be interested in the other panelists' views on this.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting, and I thought you did so marvelously in the thesis, is you made me sort of begin to wrap my brain around in a more serious way, what do we mean when we talk about objectivity? I think a lot of times when you listen to people in the public diplomacy business, particularly in history, but I'm sure it's equally applicable today, when they talk about objectivity, they tend to frame it in some ways like Ross did in a couple of his comments, where it's we did not cover things, right? We didn't deliberately self-censor, and so it's almost this very clear black and white case. We did not report something. But the cases you analyzed involved a lot more sort of meaningful questions of nuance and style, right? So you can even go back sort of the 1963 Martin Luther King-led march on Birmingham, right? You can imagine two very different reports coming out of that. One sort of, obviously, you're not going to not report it because it doesn't look good. So you highlight that there was a march on Birmingham, there was X number of people, and it met some resistance and was mildly unpleasant. Another might begin with a lead that talks about an attack dog jumping on a young child and getting the child gripped in its jaws, or dramatize or make real the impact of the water cannons on kids and women and defenseless civilians, right? Those are colossal questions that you highlighted in your thesis directly relate to the perceptions of objectivity. So it's not just the facts. It's something about what they evoke in the meaning of that audience. And so that's why the implications are much grander than simply a sort of just the facts. We're not going to subject ourselves to censorship, right? It's also in telling that story, what feelings do we evoke? And that's the power. That's the great power of journalism. It's not just purveyor of information, but it's also what feelings you evoke. And that's where objectivity becomes, I think, in your own framework, much more subjective and much more relative, and in some ways much more subversive and potentially damaging from various perspectives.
Yes. In Al Jazeera's coverage of the events since the Arab revolts, there's been seen that it's becoming less objective. So, for example, this week coverage of the events in Bahrain, or its perceived exaggeration of the events in Syria. So, basically, do you see that Al Jazeera's importance will be declining in the Middle East? And if that's going to create a gap, but who's going to fill this gap? The question is for Charlie and the panelists as well.
In my thesis, I did deal with the fact that Al Jazeera is inconsistent. They are. It's at some level. I said in my remarks that they're not a mouthpiece for the government, but and I think that's generally true. But at some level, they are, and they definitely soft-pedaled stories on the protests in Bahrain, protests in Saudi Arabia, throughout the Gulf. They were very cautious. They were very cautious because those events threatened to upset the ruling power structure of the family that funds Al Jazeera. So so it's been inconsistent, and it's also been, as you said, I think sensational in its coverage in Syria and in Libya. That said, so I don't know. I can't make any. I wouldn't want to make any predictions about what happens to Al Jazeera's audience now. I think. I mean, it seems to me that the last 10 years of the Arab media market have shown that Al Jazeera's example and Al Arabiya and there's been a proliferation of new broadcast networks in the Arab world. And it seems to me that process of fragmentation will probably continue, and so any market share that Al Jazeera loses will be picked up by one of its new competitors or some news station, and that's great. I think that's really good. And in some ways, I think as Professor Osgood said. Al Hurra has just been left behind, and it sort of doesn't have a purpose. I mean, its purpose has been eclipsed because there's a wealth of competing satellite broadcasters in the Middle East that are providing relatively accurate and objective news. But
Any further on that? Yes, in the back.
When we broadcast to an Afghan audience, presumably we tell them what our goals are, what we hope to accomplish in that country. If so, I'd like to know myself. When do they tell us what, when do we capture Berlin or something? What are we doing?
Well, I mean, the broadcast to the RFE's broadcast to Afghanistan, and I hope Ross will elaborate on what I have to say here. It's a point of pride for Radio Free Europe. It's the number one broadcaster in the country. 60% of the adult Afghans listen to Radio Free Europe's Pashto and Dari broadcasts. I think it's more of a news broadcast. Whatever American goals are laid out or on air are laid out by members of the NATO coalition in Afghanistan, or maybe by the remarks the ambassador would make in an interview. As to our goals there, your guess is as good as mine at this point. But I think that the key is always to it seems to me our interest in broadcasting should be from the ground up rather than the top down, and so reporting on how ordinary Afghans have been affected by the war, reporting on daily life in Kabul or Kandahar, and talking about giving a ground level picture of things for Afghans, and then tying that in with what American officials or other coalition officials are saying about what the future holds for the foreign presence in Afghanistan.
Please.
I can't add much to that. All politics is local. All audience's interest is local, and if the RFE broadcasts to Afghanistan have an audience, as they do, it's because the audience is turning to those broadcasts to find out what's going on, not in Washington, but in their province, which they're not getting from other media sources. And sort of the big issues of war and peace are probably not coming through in those broadcasts, except in the way that Charlie's outlined, interviews with American officials. I suspect if we all went back and looked through those broadcasts for the last 3 months, we would not find a coherent statement of what the U.S. thinks its sort of objective is, other than what's said day to day, and that's in that kind of very difficult situation that may be the best you can do. There are a lot of other countries and situations where I think you can do a lot better than that and be a lot more effective. But this, of course, is a very special and very difficult environment.
Yes?
I think all three of you kind of alluded to this a bit over the last hour or so, but I'm curious as to what kind of distinction you make between subjectivity and empathetic objectivity, and if there is a distinction, and if you do see one there, that what might cause that, or what are the main factors behind it?
That's your question.
Really for you?
That is for me. So, well, I think it comes back to what does the audience think is subjective, and what does the audience think is objective. I think an objective I can't. It depends person to person, but I think basically if you can mash into a news broadcast or a news story as many perspectives as your idealized target audience member, you want to be able to provide as many perspectives to that audience member as he thinks is relevant to the story as possible, and I think portray all the facts that are relevant that he would consider relevant. And I think, as Professor Osgood said, provide some sort of emotional connection that plays to a sense of group identity, to different group identities that audience member might have, or shared collective history. And it's not. I guess there's no cut and dried answer. The definition is in some ways completely useless, because it's only a very rough idea. But I think the idea is there's no real. I don't think there's any sort of real objectivity. There can only be what the audience likes and what the audience doesn't like. And so I guess what I would say is empathetic objectivity is about testing over and over and over again what is the audience like, and how can we deliver something that's honest. You don't want to deliver something the audience likes that's just a bunch of feel good mush. But something that's honest news reporting that an audience enjoys and feels like it speaks to their it speaks to their needs. That's objective, and I think anything that falls short of that isn't quite objective. And I don't know if I hope that's yeah.
Oh, I thought maybe I'd just highlight a personal anecdote that reflects on this. Sort of coincidentally, as I drove up from Williamstown today, I was listening to a podcast of Friday's Diane Rehm show on NPR that featured a conversation with, she does this news roundup where she features journalists, and usually they're domestic, but in this case it was a journalist from the BBC and a journalist from Al Jazeera speaking to a host from NPR. So I was reflecting on your thesis of listening to three government-backed radio commentators speculate on various questions, and I couldn't help but notice the sort of interesting parallels. But the BBC, the topic of discussion was this incident that happened just recently where a whole bunch of copies of the Quran were incinerated, which caused all kinds of chaos and rioting and madness in Afghanistan, and certainly did very little to Pakistan.
It continues.
Yeah, so it has done very little to serve U.S. interests. And the BBC person kept every now and then kept interjecting, sort of trying to empathize with how this error could happen. Oh, maybe it was, they have these corporals who sometimes get, put in these situations, and, they're not the smartest tools in the shed, and whatever, pick your metaphor, and maybe it was this or that, maybe it was that. And the Al Jazeera commenter was incredibly reasonable sounding, but basically said the same thing for the duration of the interview, which is, regardless of how it happened, you have to admit it's colossally stupid and colossally damaging and colossally short-sighted, and we should know better by now after 10 years. And I kept thinking to myself, if I were, first of all, I read that argument resonated with me because it seemed about right, but also I imagined it probably resonated with his audience quite well. Let's not try to find out, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. It was, look, it doesn't matter how it happened. It's colossally stupid. And that was, in a nutshell to me, that was empathetic objectivity based on the audience that he speaks to. That's what they expect to hear.
Yes.
I wondered if the panel could just speak briefly to the future of Voice of America as they see it. Putting together your various comments, it seems to me that given the modest goals we should have for this kind of enterprise and the indirect long-term benefits that it offers, that there aren't that many places in the world where it's really an appropriate investment. And given the fact that even in the Middle East today, there are many different sources of reasonably reliable news that people can consume, we could perhaps save some money there and not really make a go of it. So I wondered, do you see an ambitious role for this or a modest, restricted role? What's the appropriate scope? Looking forward.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there are still places where it has a role. I think there are fewer places than ever where it has where it can really make a huge dent. I think in much of the post-Soviet space, there's it's still true that there are very few independent media outlets. I think much of East Asia, the Middle East has a burgeoning media market. Latin America, Africa, VOA services to Africa are still very popular, and I don't know how much longer that will be the case. But I'm really ill-equipped to answer this question. But I do think that broadcasting itself is sort of a dying thing, and so I mean that's a huge question as to how to approach the idea of public diplomacy through journalism, how to approach that in the post-broadcast age, and I don't know. I don't really have much of a. I think it should still play a role, but I'm open to other ideas. But I think that going about it, we ought to be, if we're going to do this, we should do it above board and honestly. But in terms of the future of, where this is still appropriate, I defer to Ross and Professor Osgood.
I repeat myself, I suppose, a bit. I can see a need for and a purpose for, and again, broadcast by now means multimedia. So not just, it's not radio, it's internet, it's social media, it's SMS, it's you name it, it's Facebook, it's Twitter. Domestically focused, audience-centric, messages in two countries that where it's important enough for the United States to do that, of the two kinds that I talked about, where you got repressive regimes that matter to the United States, and where you've got transitional societies or authoritarian, loosening authoritarian, whatever societies that are important to the United States. How one does that gets into institutional and bureaucratic issues, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, where it's hard to see the status quo continuing. I guess the thing I feel most strongly about as part of this discussion, I don't, and I mentioned that earlier, I don't really see that the Voice of America can be a useful instrument for promoting America's message, for selling America. There are other instruments to do that. I don't think this kind of broadcast covering all kinds of media, I don't think that's a very effective way to do that anymore.
I'd probably be the cranky guy on the panel about in my answer to this question. I think that a lot of this stuff is increasingly superfluous and often counterproductive and sometimes unhelpful, and it's done in the name of being helpful. But especially in a world we live in an intensely media-rich environment, foreigners don't hunger for news about the United States or exposure to American culture. They hunger for exposure to their own culture and news about their own societies. And to the extent that the U.S. is perceived to be meddling or trying to meddle or trying to influence, even if VOA is tremendously objective, I think it still creates this impression of meddlesomeness that is generally unhelpful. So I think in terms of a way of reaching and trying to persuade, it's probably got to be on the lowest end of the totem pole, and that there are far, I think you take all that money that we're spending on Al-Hurra and put it into exchange programs, that's a pretty good swap. And yeah, you might be reaching technically a smaller audience, but I think you're going to have certainly any of a dozen studies which suggest you're going to have a much more positive long-range impact. Foreigners can get Time magazine. They can get CNN in the Middle East, for crying out loud. Do we really need Al-Hurra? I'm not convinced of it.
Yeah.
Professor Valentino, more of a comment than a question. I actually thought you all would say the Middle East seems like the hardest possible place for this kind of project to work. It's just that the perception is just the opposite of what we had in Europe, where there was somebody else who was clearly the foreign occupier, and we were providing the people in that part of the world with a voice that the occupier wouldn't allow them to have. Whereas in the Middle East today, in many corners, we're perceived as the occupier. And who would listen to what the occupier says or allows to be said, no matter how objective? It's going to be tainted with the view that it came from the occupier. But almost anywhere else outside of those parts of the world, and there aren't that, it's the Middle East primarily today, I could see the same kind of role that the radio played during the Cold War. All of these repressive regimes in Africa, other parts of Asia, where we could help the local culture have a voice. That seems to me, at least what I took from the thesis, as exactly what we can do. Give a voice to people who don't already have one. Give them a radio station or a media outlet that they can call their own. And that might be in the service of a whole lot of other goals that the United States has, including, broadly, democratization. And it seems like that's one service that this can continue to provide. It's just that the one area where it gets the most discussion these days seems like the hardest possible place to affect it. But there's still lots of other, most of the world is not the Middle East. So.
Great. Further questions, comments, reactions? Well, if not, please join me in thanking our panelists and especially